Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So all of the great information that Mackenzie was just sharing is available if you click on the link in the chat. So in the chat, there's a link and you can click on it and it will have all the recordings to how do you buy Naomi's book, how do you watch her TED Talk, how do you see the recordings we had before, and how do you find out what's coming up next. It's great to have so many people with us today. David just said he's tuning in from snowy Scotland, which is fantastic. If you want to share where you're tuning in from too, go ahead and do that in the chat. We are delighted to be able to host Naomi Oreskes today. And you may know her work because she has been looking at the question of science and trust for a very long time. The movie Merchants of Doubt, in the book by the same name, is based on her work. We screened that movie a number of years ago when we were running a film series at the local theater. It seems like 10 years ago that we could do something like that, but it was really just a year ago. Now she's here with us today to talk about her newest book, which is called Why Trust Science. I am joined by my colleague, Bryan Giemza. Bryan, you want to turn your camera on now? He is a literature professor here at Texas Tech University as well. And here's Bryan. Oh, I see there's more people joining us from Utah, from Delaware, from Oklahoma, Massachusetts, Alberta, excellent, Ireland, nice, Maryland, New Hampshire, lots of people from Texas. Oh, Toronto, great to see somebody from Toronto, Vermont. Everybody's saying that it's snowy, but you know what? It snows in Lubbock. In fact, we got our last snowstorm, I think we got 5 inches and we could snow again. All right, Bryan, welcome and tell us just briefly a little bit about why are we co-hosting this book series together?
Sure. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. And thank you so much for being here. I'm Bryan Giemza. I'm reporting live from sunny Caprock Canyon, where there's no snow at the moment. I want to just tell you a little bit about this campus-wide initiative that we have called Creating Livable Futures that invites us to talk about sustainability and resilience, and just tell you something about what we have in mind with the book series. It's a special privilege to work at the Sowell Family Collection in Literature, Community, and the Natural World, an archive at Texas Tech that collects the work of writers who are scientists and humanists, and plenty of people who are both. So when you think about a climate books and a climate book series, probably your thoughts turn right to the science part of that. But I want to tell you, our series of readings wants to show that studying climate is about science, of course, but we also keep in mind that climate is one of the original interdisciplinary subjects. And at the risk of turning into a gushing fanboy here, we are so lucky to have Naomi Oreskes with us tonight, a national leader in those conversations about science and climate. She's here to help us understand the deepest themes of science, including how it's something we do together. As she observes, we are social animals, and the social character of science has to do with what dignifies its worth and who we are as a community, and even our brilliant failures and successes. Our series is part of a big conversation about science. We want to offer you an experience that is the next best thing to being together right now in a bookstore and talking about inspiring books like Why Trust Science. It's the party where we get to talk about literature and poetry and economics and just about being human. In fact, it's a place where we like to talk about everything interesting under the sun as part of the discussion. So we need you to be a part of that discussion as well, and we will welcome your questions a little later. So for now, that's our vision. I want to say again, we're very glad you're here, and we're extremely grateful and privileged to have Naomi Oreskes join us tonight.
Thank you so much, Naomi. If you don't mind turning on your camera now and unmuting yourself. There we go. We would love for you to join us. Let me pin you. Too. Okay, there we go. All right, it's great to see everybody here. We've got lots of people telling us where they're joining us from, and we're so grateful to have you joining us here, Naomi. So let us start off. Bryan is going to ask you the first question. Go ahead, Bryan.
Well, sure. I think we just would love to hear about what's the creation story for this book. I know that maybe it began as a lecture. Can you tell us how that turned into a book?
Well, thanks for the question. And I just want to say it's a pleasure to be with all of you. And I'm reporting from snowy Carlisle, Massachusetts, where we had 5 inches of snow today. And I'm happy to say that I went out cross-country skiing in the woods with my dog. And one of the reasons I work on climate change is because I love winter and I love snow and I love skiing. And there is nothing as beautiful as being out in the woods with your dog on a snowy day. I know not everyone in Texas feels that way, but I certainly do. And I know some of the other people on this call do. So your question, how did this get started? Well, it didn't begin as a lecture, but it began in a lecture, or really in lectures. And I had an experience that I'm sure Katharine has shared. So about 15 years ago, a long time ago now, I started giving lectures on the history of climate science. I'm a historian of science. I'm interested in the development of scientific knowledge, and I'm interested in the reception of scientific knowledge, both within scientific communities and beyond them. And about 15 years ago, I started working on the history of climate science. And I came up against climate change denial very quickly. As soon as I became a public speaker on this issue, I started getting all of the pushback that Katharine and others in the space have experienced. And so I started to develop a public lecture on the history of climate science. And it was a very carefully crafted lecture going back to Tyndall and Arrhenius and Guy Callender to show how scientists had been working on this question for more than 150 years, how it wasn't a hoax, or if it was a hoax, it began in Ireland 150 years ago, and why scientists had been motivated to work on this question and what the evidence was, and to really walk the audience through the story so that people could come to an understanding of why scientists had taken up this question, what information we had on it, and why scientists had come to a consensus that this was a grave and serious problem. And on more than one occasion, I would give this talk, and someone in the audience, I have to say, usually a man, I'm just reporting, I'm just being scientific about this, would stand up, sometimes put his hands on his hips and say, typically in a belligerent tone, well, that's all very well and good, but why should we trust the science? And I remember at one point standing there thinking, okay, well, this guy's belligerent, but it's a legitimate question, right? So many of us who are dedicated to science, who have become scientists, or who love science because of what it offers us, take it for granted that science is trustworthy. We don't stop to actually answer that question and think, well, actually, it's a good question. Why should people trust science? And so I decided that it was a question that deserved an answer. And so I started then developing a lecture specifically to try to answer that question. That became a series of Tanner lectures at Princeton. The lectures, people liked them. And so an editor at Princeton University Press said, hey, why don't we make this a book? And so we did.
Excellent. I love that. You can see, I just love these discussions, everybody, if you're listening, because getting behind the curtain, so to speak, and figuring out where these things come from is really interesting. And that leads perfectly into my first question for you, Naomi, which is this. I'm a scientist, and I have people telling me literally almost every day, either me or other scientists or all of us, that they don't trust us. They also tell us why. They say either it's because we're stupid, we haven't thought of something that they've thought of, or we're in it for the money, or we have an agenda. We're just trying to push some type of agenda. So if you could say in a nutshell, why should people trust scientists? And if so, why?
Well, that's a great question. And of course, the reason I wrote this book is to answer that. And it's a 200-page book, so a little hard to summarize in a soundbite. But the short answer, in a way, is the original talk I gave. That first of all, when you look at this long history of scientists who have been working on this issue for 150 years, you realize it's not even plausible to think that all these different people on 5 different continents all had the exact same agenda. That's just not really plausible. And so much of this scientific work was done, before it was even really a political question, before Obama was elected president or Donald Trump. So the idea that there's a coherent political agenda behind this is simply not plausible. But if the question is, well, why should we trust it? Then the answer that I give in the book is because science is an enterprise that has an incredibly good track record. And if you think about other things in our lives, if you think about investing in a stock fund, for example, we always ask the question, well, what's the track record of this fund? What have the returns been? Or if we think about going to a university to study, well, what's the reputation of this place? Do its students get good jobs? So we can look at the track record of science. And there we see something that is incredible, really incredibly remarkable, that science as we know it is at least 400 years old, maybe older. Scientific institutions are among some of our oldest continuously operating institutions. So science as a practice is older than the United States. It's older than the US Constitution. Not quite as old as the Catholic Church, but almost as old as the Protestant Church, right? So this is a very old institution. And so anything that has survived that long is obviously doing something right. And in this case, the something right is giving us reliable knowledge about the natural world. And we can give example after example after example of where scientists have got it right, where we've cured diseases, we've traveled to the moon, so many things that we've done on the basis of scientific knowledge.
And although you're right, the institution of science itself doesn't predate the Catholic Church. Scientists, of course, do. One of my favorite classes I ever took was the history of astronomy. And it is absolutely humbling how much the early Greeks knew thousands of years ago. I mean, they knew not only that the earth was round, they knew the circumference of the earth, they knew how far it was to the sun. I mean, they had measured incredible things using science thousands of years ago. And we are really just, in some cases, rediscovering what they knew. And
no, that's absolutely right. And I think the reason why I say 400 years is because there's no question that there were scientists doing science in ancient Greece, also in ancient Egypt. Arabic mathematics, goes back an extremely long way. But the current institutions, we have had continuity, even in our current institutions, have been continuous for 400 years. And that's actually remarkable because very few human institutions actually have that degree of continuity. So yes, absolutely, we can go back even further if we let go of the institutional continuity and then just talk about sort of the conceptual continuity, then we're talking thousands of years.
I have a follow on from what you said earlier, Naomi. I think it's fascinating that you also started out, I think, as a geologist. You do obviously all kinds of science, including climate change. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how that worked in terms of your professional journey and where your curiosity has taken you.
That's a great question. Well, I became an earth scientist because I loved the natural world. I was one of those sorts of children who collected rocks and bugs, but mainly I just really liked being outside. I love nature. And so science was a way to be in connection with nature and to earn a living. So in a way, I wasn't in it for the money in the sense that it's a job and it's a really, really good job. It's a job where you can be paid a good salary to have a life doing something that's really fun and really exciting. So yes, in a sense, we're in it for the money, but not the money in the sense of big bucks, but the money in the sense of it's a good, really good job for those of us who like this sort of thing. But I also always had a lot of other interests, and you spoke at the top of the hour about poetry and literature. And so I was always reading novels in my free time, sometimes philosophy, sometimes theology. When I worked in the outback of Australia, I read the Bible at night, and I really understood why so many biblical prophets spend time in the desert. And I always felt like that was a problem. I felt like it was something that as a scientist, I wasn't supposed to be doing. There was this kind of weird message in science that if you wanted to be a scientist, it had to be all science all the time, and you couldn't or shouldn't really be interested in other things. And if you were interested in science, especially like literature, that was viewed as kind of a little bit odd. And so for many years, it was sort of like being in the closet. It was like I had this side of myself that I didn't really talk about. It was kind of hidden. And then I went to graduate school, and I decided to take a class in philosophy of science just for fun. Just because I was interested, and I thought I'm in a great university, there's an opportunity. And as it happened, this was, everything in life, there's the parts we plan for and the parts that are just lucky. I was lucky that the person who taught this philosophy of science class was actually a historian, Peter Galison, a famous historian of physics and physical sciences. I didn't know the history of science existed as a field. I didn't know that you could earn a living as a thing called a historian of science. I don't know anyone who grew up thinking, when I grow up, I want to be a historian of science. It's just not something we even knew about. But I discovered this amazing field in which all the things I cared about, all the things I loved, reading, writing, science, all came together. And where suddenly the fact that I loved to read and to write was not considered bad, that was considered good, because as a historian, you have to do those things. And so that was my eureka moment, that there was this field where I could, maybe if I was lucky, get a job. It's not like there's a million jobs in history of science, but there are some that I could earn a living, not just doing science, but studying and understanding it in a broader perspective, and understanding science in social context.
I feel like as scientists, often it's really more of a vocation, what we do, and a passion. And you're right, we're lucky that we can get paid for doing something that we enjoy. And it's not just something that, we bring a salary check home with. It's something that we'd probably do anyways.
I mean, it's sort of like saying that doctors are in it for the money. I mean, some doctors are. I mean, some doctors are very well paid, but most people become doctors because medicine is fascinating. There's an opportunity to earn a good living helping people and doing something that makes the world a better place. And I think that's how most scientists feel about doing science.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. In fact, that's why I'm a climate scientist, is because this is an issue that affects people, real people today, and we have to fix it. So I just finished the final manuscript to my book that's coming out in September last night.
That's a great moment.
Oh, it was an incredible moment. Yes. So the next stage is the proofs. So I'm at the proof stage.
Good.
Writing a book is an absolute journey. So I wanted to ask you, in your process of writing this book, which I know kind of started as lectures, and then you got responses for the book too, because if you haven't read her book yet, it actually has Naomi's thoughts, and that has responses to them, which is so interesting. In all of that process, which is sort of like running a marathon or climbing Mount Everest, what was one of your most memorable moments there?
In writing the book?
Yeah.
Whew. Yeah, it's really hard to say. I think it is a little bit like climbing Mount Everest. I actually haven't climbed Mount Everest, but I have been to Everest Base Camp. And there is a way in which once you get there, you forget about all the pain and suffering along the way. So I feel like writing a book is a little bit like that it's hard. It's really hard work. I'm trying to finish another book now, and it's practically killing me. But then it's done, and then you're proud of what you've achieved. It's a little bit like giving birth, and then the pain kind of disappears. So I can't honestly say there was one moment. I guess the only thing I could say, that one thing that I think was really good, you mentioned about the responses in the book. We did that because it was part of the structure of the Tanner lectures at Princeton, that there would be respondents. And that's not that unusual in academic lectures, right? We often do lectures where people are invited to respond. But the editor at Princeton Press thought it would be really interesting to include those responses. And then when we got the reviews back, the reviewers were very, very positive about that. And one of them said, well, this is awesome, because in a way, what Oreskes is doing here is practicing what she preaches. Because in the book, what I argue is that the critical thing about science is not the ideas, that actually the way we talk about science, in my opinion, overstates the importance of the sort of creative process by which we come up with the idea in the first place. What's more important from the point of view of the trustworthiness of science is the critical process of vetting claims, getting feedback, adjusting what you think in light of critical feedback, that's really where the rubber hits the road in terms of what we could call the verification of scientific knowledge. And we, in a way, had done that with this book by me getting criticism, making adjustments, responding to the criticisms. And so one of the reviewers said, this is really great, because this book actually, demonstrates how that process works. And I hadn't even thought of that. I thought, wow, that was really dumb of me not to think about it. It's like, I wish I could claim that I had thought about that right from the beginning, which in fact I had not, but it was so great. And I thought, yeah, it's actually really great that we have done that. And one of the ironies is we now have a few foreign editions in which the foreign editors have said, we don't really want the discussion part. And, publication is a tough business. People's margins are small. And when someone's offering to do a Swedish edition of your book, you don't really argue. So the Swedish edition will not have the discussion, which is too bad. But I do think it's great that we have it. And it was a great process to think through the issues that other smart people raised in response to the framework that I had offered. What was
Well,
the hardest part for you in your book? Can I ask that?
Well, every time I finish a draft, I feel like, whoa, that was the hardest part. And
Mm.
then you go to the next draft and you're like, this chapter is just garbage. It has to go, and you have to rewrite it. And then too, you know, getting people to comment on it. So Bryan was one of the colleagues who very kindly read my draft, and you know, being a scientist, even though I wasn't publishing with an academic press, I sent out various chapters for review. And it's almost like sending out your baby to get commented on, and then you get the comments back. You're like, how could you say that? And then after you sleep on it, you read it again, you're like, oh my gosh, that was totally right.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I always tell my graduate students, start with the presumption that the reviewers are correct, right? And even if they may be right for the wrong reasons, like when reviewers flag something that's not working in the book, maybe the thing they flag isn't actually the key thing, but something's not right, and you have to figure out what isn't right and fix it. And that's what science is all about, right? Being able to take the criticism, and we have to be thick-skinned, right? It's not always fun, it's not always easy, but that willingness to listen to criticism, take it on board, and adjust what you think in light of criticism and new information. That's the key to science, and it's also the key to writing books, which is why some of us can do both.
Exactly. Bryan?
Well, okay, so I don't want to take up too much time here because we'd love to hear an excerpt from the book, Naomi, if you'd care to share one, but maybe I can actually jump ahead and fit in one more question, which is, I know that most writers, that there's only one thing they love talking about more than their current book, and it's their next book. And since you mentioned it, I am fascinated by this. Am I right? Cold War oceanography is your topic.
Yeah.
You've got to tell us more.
Okay, well, I have to say I'm maybe not like most authors. I actually don't like talking about my next because I'm sort of like weirdly superstitious about talking about things that aren't finished, maybe in part for the reason Katharine just said, that you know that you may have to change some things. But in this case, Science and the Mission is done. It's done. It's been out of my hands for a year. The production has been slow this year because of COVID. So we actually had hoped to have this book several months ago. But it's actually something I was working on for a really long time. It's actually what I was working on when I met Eric Conway and we tripped over the Merchants of Doubt story. So that tells you how old this is, because Merchants of Doubt came out in 2010. And this is kind of a fun story about how life sometimes takes you places you weren't expecting. This was supposed to be my full professor book, a big, serious book about how science really works. And I chose oceanography for two reasons, which I hope the audience will appreciate. One was deeply intellectual. I was interested in the question of how funding affects what we know and whether or not it matters who's funding scientific research. This is the money question. And oceanography seemed like a really great place to look at that question, because in history, we don't have controlled experiments, but this was close, because until World War II, there was very, very little funding for oceanography in the United States. And what there was came almost entirely from private philanthropy. Starting during World War II, that changed completely. Huge amounts of money started flowing into oceanography, almost all of it from the US Navy. So that was an opportunity to see how the science was changed by a changing structure of funding. But also, I was a mother with young children, and I needed a project where I could be in the archives in the afternoon and still be home for dinner. And Scripps Institution of Oceanography had this amazing archive, and I was teaching at UC San Diego at that time. So I was so lucky. I thought, I have this incredibly juicy intellectual project that's really well framed, and I can be home for dinner. So I started working on that, and the book was 60% done when I tripped over the Merchants of Doubt story. And I made a decision that the Merchants of Doubt story had to be told. And so I put Science and the Mission on a back burner for what I thought would be a couple of years while I just wrote this other book. Well, a couple of years turned into a decade, but I did finally get back to Science and the Mission, and it's now finished, and it will be published by University of Chicago Press. The short answer, so the question of the book is, what difference does it make who funds science? The short answer is a heck of a lot.
That sounds very interesting. And according to at least Amazon, your book is coming out in April. Is that right?
Yeah, it's supposed, they've promised me that it really is April now. As I said, we've had several delays, mainly because of COVID delaying things, but it is,
Yes.
it is in production. It should be out very soon.
Yes, that happened too. My book ended up getting delayed 6 months because of COVID also.
Yeah, but
Well,
of course, when you've waited 10 years to finish a book, what's a few more months?
Exactly. I know I took advantage to update all my numbers because, it's nice to have like a nice round number for 2020. So I went through and I changed all the numbers in the book because I had extra time.
Good. That's good.
Well, we would love to hear you read a short excerpt from Why Trust Science, whatever your favorite part is.
Okay, I missed that in the notes, but I can easily do that if you just give me 1 minute to go pull out the book. So I will be right back. You can chat among yourselves.
Absolutely, we can do that. And if you have not had a chance yet, like I said, to watch or read Merchants of Doubt, we highly recommend that. And I will put a link to that in the chat too. Watching the movie is particularly stunning because you'll recognize a lot of the same people that you've seen in the news the past few years on basically peddling doubt on the science, on cigarettes, on climate change, on flame retardants and mattresses, which shocked me. I knew nothing about that until I read Naomi's work. But that is really an excellent resource. And Merchants of Doubt is kind of a fun movie to watch with the family on the weekend too. All right, I will put links to those in the chat too. And I found the link to the next book, which is Science and Emission, and that one's in the chat. And don't forget, after the readings, we're going to be taking your questions. We already have a lot of great questions, but if you have more, just put them in the Q&A that's right at the bottom of the screen, as long as you're watching this live. If you're watching this recorded, too bad you don't get to ask a question. That's why you have to be live. Put them in the Q&A live, and we'll be taking them after Naomi gives us her reading. Take it away, Naomi.
Okay, well, this is actually great because I have done several readings. As you can see, my version of the book has various flags, and I have one flagged that I think is particularly appropriate for today because it's short, and also because it actually involves Katharine's inspiration. Oh. And I won't say exactly where it will go, but Katharine will know, I think, when I read it. So this is towards the end of the book where I'm discussing the issue of values in science. And I make the argument that most scientists have been trained to think that we shouldn't talk about our values, that values stand in tension with objectivity, and that if we want science to be objective, we have to suppress our personal opinions, and also that if we want people to trust science, we have to suppress our values. I think that's completely wrong. I think it's wrong on many, many levels, which if we had more time, I could talk about, but I'll just read you this little bit of the book where I talk about the issue. And so what I'm saying here is that when we ask people to trust us, there's a value component implicit in that because of course trust is value laden, right? We trust people who we think are trustworthy. So if we say that science is value neutral or value free, it's kind of like saying we have no values. And so this is where the book picks up. Would you trust a person who has no values? The answer is obvious. You would not. Such a person would be a sociopath. Nor would you trust a person whose values you consider to be anathema to your own. But if you thought that person shared at least some of your values, even if perhaps not all of them, you might be willing to listen. And you might accept some of what you were hearing. Therefore, whether or not claims of value neutrality are epistemologically defensible, it is clear that they do not work in practice because they do not work to permit communication and build bonds of trust. The dominant style in scientific writing is not only to hide the values of the authors, but to hide their humanity altogether. Not only are values unexpressed, emotions are expunged and adjectives eschewed, but the word I is implicitly forbidden, even in single authored papers. This is tied to the performance of objectivity. The ideal scientific paper is written not only as if the author had no values or feelings, but as if there were no human author at all. Scientists may feel that there is simply no way for them to forge bonds of trust with climate change deniers or people who think that the world is 6,000 years old. Perhaps that is true. I once publicly despaired of reaching millenarians whose eschatology tells them that the world is about to end. So why worry about climate change? But then when I did so despair publicly, The next day, several correspondents offered me strategies to reach them based on Christian values and teachings. People suggested that the way to reach people was through their values, and social science research supports this as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's so true, because we often, social scientists will tell us, we have our judgments, we have our opinions, and then we use our brain to justify why we're right. So the brain is more often used to show why we're right than it is to form new opinions. So we have a lot of fantastic questions, and people, you can keep it coming if you want to. But I'm going to kick off with the very first question, which is from Mackenzie. It's a very simple one. Why don't people trust science?
Well, that's a great question, and I appreciate the opportunity to answer that, because the reality is most people do. And it's actually quite important for us to know this, so that we understand the character of the issue we're dealing with. Because if you misdiagnose the problem, then your solutions won't work. So many studies, the Pew Research Foundation study on this is the best one, but there's also an excellent recent study from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. These studies show that the majority of the American people, actually a large majority, probably 70 or 80%, do trust science. Something like 83% of Americans think that science basically makes our lives better, and do trust science overall, and do think that scientists are trustworthy. In fact, scientists are the second most trusted group in America, second only to military leaders, and way, way above politicians, business leaders, and journalists. Now, admittedly, politicians is a low bar, but still, we are trusted. But what we also know is that people resist scientific findings in specific areas that they think challenge their values, their religious beliefs, and their worldviews. And as Katharine knows as well as I do, we see this particularly in the area of evolutionary biology, the area of climate change, and now recently COVID-19. So what that tells us is that for most people, actually, and this is a really important thing that I think some people miss, for 70 or 80% of the American people, facts do matter and information is good, and they welcome good scientific information, especially if it's explained in plain language. But there is this other group, and it's probably 20 to 30%, sometimes more, depending upon exactly how the question is framed, who think that science is at odds with their values. And so this is why the value issue is so important. It's what I call implicatory denial. People reject findings that they think imply a problem for their value system. And to address that, you can't just give people facts. You actually have to be willing to engage in a value-based conversation. And we have really, really good evidence now. There's been wonderful work done on this issue on the evolutionary biology front by scholars at Arizona State, people at the National Center for Science Education. There was a very interesting study at Arizona State where they found that many undergraduates who were resistant to evolutionary biology were resistant to it, not specifically because they saw it as violating their religious beliefs, although that is an issue too, but because many of them thought that it meant that life was meaningless, right? Because if evolution is a random process, then that seems to mean that life has no meaning. But of course, that's not actually what evolutionary biology teaches us. The meaning of life is not a scientific question. The meaning of life is a philosophical and theological and metaphysical question. And it's possible to separate those and say, well, actually, if you look at the question, scientists have all kinds of different views about the meaning of life. And there are evolutionary biologists who are religious Christians. Ken Miller at Brown University has been a great spokesperson. He's a observing Catholic and also a biologist. The late Sir John Houghton was an evangelical Protestant, also an active climate scientist. If you show students these examples of scientists, and particularly if you can give them writings by these people where they talk about how they can be a scientist and also an evangelical Christian, or how they can be a scientist and also embrace evolutionary biology, and show them that it doesn't mean that life is meaningless, that it's a different kind of question, and we can have a separate conversation about the meaning of life, that for many people is transformative. And we can do that. And it's not actually that hard once you realize what the question is.
That, speaking of, it's transformative. I'm looking at the chat stream and people are saying, wow, this question that you raised, would you trust someone without values? It's a part of who we all are. And since you brought up Darwin, there's a great question in the stream here from Ken asking, or first saying science, namely Darwin, took away the specialness of human beings. Isn't that the root of a lot of modern anger at science? What do you think?
Well, I think that's a really, really important question. And I even have a term for that. I call it Homo sapien exceptionalism, right? Because we do know that for many people, this is a difficulty. And we even know that there are many of our own students. We did a survey at UCSD where we looked at this. We found that many of our students, and this was important too, because it blew away the myth that this is only a problem in places like Texas. Right? This is an issue everywhere, including in hip, liberal, democratic California. So what we found was that a very significant number of our students accepted evolutionary theory for everything else, but not people. And it was exactly what that question was just about. The feeling that it takes away the exceptional quality of humans. But again, as per my previous answer, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, it's possible for evolutionary processes to produce something exceptional. And I think we have lots of evidence that humans are exceptional in many ways. We do all kinds of things that other animals and plants don't do. And that's not at odds with evolutionary theory. So then there are other different kinds of questions that come up, like all the people who, well, like Fermi's paradox, or all the people who want to say, well, how come the kind of higher intelligence and consciousness that humans have isn't present in other species? And then you get into really, really interesting questions about, well, maybe it is present. I mean, how about whales, right? Who often mate for life? Or how about the social structures of insect communities? And again, suddenly you've opened up the space for a really interesting conversation about, well, what is it that makes humans exceptional? And what does it mean to say that humans are exceptional? And suddenly we're in this whole interesting philosophical space. And again, you realize that it's possible to accept evolutionary theory and also believe that humans are exceptional.
Mm-hmm. Well, that relates to another question, actually a couple of questions that were being asked, which is, what about the relationship between science and spirituality? You've touched on that already a little bit. There's also organizations that people might be interested in knowing about, like BioLogos. We'll put a link to BioLogos in the chat. It is a Christian organization that was started by Francis Collins, who's the head of the National Institutes of Health, and it's all about reconciling science on origins with Christian belief. I recommend them highly. So there's a couple of different questions, and I'll just sort of put them together and paraphrase them. What do you think is the relationship between science and spirituality? How can they be connected? Is the idea of non-overlapping separate spheres or domains, yeah, is that something that you would ascribe to? Or what have your thoughts led you to so far?
Yeah, well, again, another great question. And of course, that question always makes people think, or makes me think of Stephen Jay Gould and his famous non-overlapping magisteria. Yes. So that's one solution to the problem. And I think, or I don't even want to call it a problem, let's call it a question. Mm-hmm. So one solution is to say these are just different realms. Mm-hmm. Science deals with certain kinds of questions about, what is and how things work. And religion and spirituality deal with why questions and questions of meaning. And I think that's an adequate possibility. And I wouldn't tell anyone who took that view that they were wrong. Mm-hmm. It's not actually how I view it. I think that these realms are overlapping. They're different, mm-hmm. but I view them as different but complementary. Mm-hmm. Because in a way, science and religion have similar goals, which is to understand the world. We want to know what the world is and why it is the way it is. But science and religion have different ways of approaching those questions. I think for me, and maybe because I'm trained as a geologist originally, I don't really even like the language of reconciliation, because that implies opposing forces that have to be reconciled. Exactly. But the history of science does not support that view. We don't have to go back very far to find that most scientists until the 20th century were religious people. And many of them were deeply religious. Often they had religious views that were not exactly the same as sort of mainstream religion of their time. So Isaac Newton, for example, famously was not a Trinitarian. He was a kind of closet Unitarian. He did not believe in the Holy Trinity. He thought that was a really problematic concept, but he was a deeply, deeply religious person. And he wrote reams and reams and reams of notebooks on this issue, on the question of how to resolve the tension between the Trinitarianism of the Protestant faith and his own belief in Unitarianism. But I mean, this is a deeply religious question, right? And this is from one of the people who we think of as one of the most important, most brilliant scientists of all time, Sir Isaac Newton, right? And he's just one example. We have so many examples of scientists who were motivated in part by a set of spiritual or religious questions. And certainly in my field, geology, this was the dominant modality of the 19th century, that people studied geology in part because they believed in the notion of a book of nature, that there were two books of God, the Word, the book of Moses, and the work. Sorry, I'm saying this badly. The Word and the work. So the Word of God was to be found in Scripture, but the work of God was to be found in nature, and that you could come to a deeper understanding of God by studying his handicraft, to know God through his work. And so many geologists in the 19th century were deeply motivated by spiritual commitments. And it's reflected for me as someone who also loves music. I always think of the great line in the oratorio, "The heavens are telling the glory of God." And I truly believe that. But it's not just the heavens, whether it's astronomy, cosmology, geology, botany. I mean, and I think even though Darwin was not a conventionally religious man and did not believe in God in the conventional 19th century sense, when you read his descriptions of flowers or beetles or barnacles, you feel this man's intense connection with the mystery of creation. So I think that we do feel God through his work or her work or their work, or whatever your conception of God might be. So I don't see this as conflicting realms, but we do know that many people do view it as conflicting. And then there's a whole complicated story about why that view has come to dominate in the United States at this moment in time, when that was not how probably most people viewed it through most of the history of science.
That brings out so many things. If we have all these wonderful questions in the stream, so I'm actually going to go back to something you said and try to kind of stitch together. In a way, all three of these questions are asking something similar. We have several email or questions, one from a young conservation scientist who asks, how can I, as an unpublished and inexperienced student, help people understand the truth and validity of science? And then kind of related to that, there's the preaching to the choir problem. The 20% or so that you mentioned earlier, Naomi, who probably aren't going to buy the book. Someone asks, how do you connect with them? Someone else asks, how can you tell us about a time when you were able to really get through to someone and get them to trust science? So there's a through line in those questions, and I think we all want to know how do we speak to people who are skeptical about the merit of science?
Yeah, well, these are great questions. And of course, Katharine has as much, if not more, experience in this realm than I do. So I'll just say a few words, and maybe Katharine might want to jump in here. I view all the work we do, whether it's published, unpublished, in teaching, in public lectures, in an event like this, as a little bit of a message in a bottle. You send out your message, but you can't really control where it goes or who receives it or how they read it. But you do your best to send the clearest, best message that you can. And so that's why, and we haven't talked about my other book, The Collapse of Western Civilization, but the cover of it, I could probably grab a copy in a minute if we have time, but the cover is a picture of a message in a bottle. We do our best. No one can control how their books are how their books are read or how their work is taken, but we do our best. And so I think that's all that any of us can do. I think for the person who wonders how they, as a young unpublished person, can connect, I want to say, you are there, man. And you actually, in a way, have a better opportunity because once you become well known, then there are people who will assume that you don't have the time for them, you don't have the patience for them. Even if you really do, people will think that you don't. And then you have this kind of extra burden of saying, no, I'm really here, I'm really listening, I'm paying attention to these questions. But when you're on the ground with people and you're not well known, that barrier is actually much, much lower. So I don't think anyone should ever think that because they haven't published yet, that they don't have important things to say and that people wouldn't be able to listen to them. I mean, I one time was with a group of graduate students, one of whom said that she sang in a choir, and people in the choir were asking her all these questions about climate change. And she was a coral reef biologist, so she felt highly qualified to talk about certain aspects of it. But she really didn't feel qualified at all to talk about many of the other aspects. But I said to her, I said, look, compared to your fellow scientists, people publishing in scientific journals, you may not be an expert on these issues, but in your community, in your choir, you are the local expert. And people are looking to you for leadership because they know that you know something about this. And even though you may know less than some other famous person, you know a whole lot more than anybody else in the choir. And that's why they're turning to you. So embrace that opportunity. And you don't have to exaggerate your knowledge. And if people ask you a question that you're not sure of, you can say, hey, I'll get back to you on that. And of course, that's the key to the third question about, reaching beyond the choir. I mean, we reach beyond the choir every day in our classrooms, right? We have all these different students who come into our classrooms with all kinds of questions, assumptions, background knowledge and lack thereof. And we don't say, oh, I can't talk to you because you don't, because you, I never say to a student, I can't talk to you because you haven't taken linear algebra, right? I never say that. I say, okay, well, tell me what you think. Tell me what you learned in high school. And let's start from there. And any one of us who's in a university setting, we all do that all the time. We know how to do it. It's not a foreign problem. So I think we can, I view all my climate work in a way as an extension of my teaching. That teaching doesn't just take place in the classroom. It takes place in public lectures. It takes place on an airplane when somebody asks me what I do for a living, and then I have that horrible moment of truth where I was like, oh, do I tell them? Am I really prepared to spend the next 3 hours talking about climate change? And the answer is always yes, so I do. So
always, really?
Well, maybe not always. There are definitely some times when I'm really tired and but then usually I'll try to do is answer one or two questions and say, I'm on my way home, I'm really tired and think I might take a nap now, and people are pretty understanding. And then just one other thing I wanted to say also about preaching to the choir, because I get that question all the time as well. I do think it's really incumbent on all of us to try as much as possible to reach out beyond the usual communities. So I think Katharine knows I have what I call my red state pledge. I no longer give talks in Massachusetts or New York. If I get invited to go to Princeton, well, I made an exception for the Tanner lectures, but in general, I don't go to Harvard, I don't go to Yale, I don't go to Princeton. They don't need me there. I don't do teach-ins in Cambridge. But if I get an opportunity to go to Oklahoma or Texas or, whatever, Nebraska, as much as possible, I always try to take the opportunity to say yes, to try to be in places where I feel that I can do the best work. But that said, I just want to also say that the choir needs support too. And if we do work that helps our own communities, that helps answer their questions, helps them figure out how to address, in a way that's part of what we're doing here tonight, right? That people, even in our own communities who are on board with our goals, they still have questions. I get questions all the time from people who are not climate change deniers, but who say something like, well, Professor Oreskes, how do we know that it's not volcanoes? And that's a totally legitimate question. And it's super important us to make the space to answer those kinds of questions too.
Well, you're in Texas right now.
I know.
Essentially.
Although it looks more like Utah where you are, Bryan, or Arizona.
No, that is Texas.
Is that Texas? Okay,
that's an hour away from here.
Oh, okay. West Texas?
Yeah, nice. It is.
Okay. Come visit. We'll take you.
Yeah, exactly.
I just want to say I have been to Lubbock, by the way. You may not know that, but for many years, my dear colleague Ron Ranger taught at Texas Tech, and I visited when he was there.
Well, we would love to host you again. I have to confess that when people ask me what I do, depending on, how late it is, sometimes I just say, oh, I'm in political science. And I will tell you, if you tell people that, and for everybody listening, I am a professor in the political science department and a climate scientist. When you tell people you're in political science, every single person, no matter who they are, they just say, oh, interesting.
Well, of course, history of science, you get that too. You get the, oh, that's nice, dear.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You even get a little sympathy these days from being in political science, I think. Well, we have, and again, we have so many good questions. We won't get to them all, but I'm going to try to put two together again. And the question here is, what do you do when two experts disagree about something? And is there such thing as too much skepticism in science?
Well, the second part of that is easy. Absolutely. I mean, one thing that drives me a little crazy are certain scientists who I think are very egotistical, and they kind of make a sort of point of pride of being, oh, I don't believe it, you know, I mean, other people think it's true, but I'm not convinced yet. I think that's just a form of grotesque egotism, like somehow you know better than everyone else. I have very, very little time for that. So yeah, I mean, skepticism is like a lot of things. There's healthy skepticism and there's corrosive skepticism. And so we need to be really clear that healthy skepticism is this kind of skepticism that motivates people to do research, to do good work, to collect more data. Corrosive skepticism is when you just go like this and say, sorry, I don't believe it. I mean, that's not helping anyone. That's not productive. As for the two experts, well, this gives me an opportunity for a shameless plug for my book, because the whole argument of the book is that it doesn't matter what two experts think. You could, of course, you can have two experts arguing. In any live science, you can always find someone who disagrees, and you can put them on television, and this is what many of the networks do, and you can make it look like there's a big debate. So what's important for us to understand is not what any individual thinks. And so my argument about science is in some ways deeply anti-individualistic. And that's actually hard for some of us to swallow. It was hard for me to swallow at first because we've been trained to think about science so much in terms of individual genius, right? The Newtons, the Einsteins, the Darwins of the world. But I don't think that's how modern science actually operates. I think modern science operates by the collective work of all the hundreds or thousands, or in the case of climate science, tens of thousands of scientists who work on particular aspects of the problem, and then who bring that knowledge together to try to figure out what the heck is going on. And so I've written a lot about consensus because it's extremely important in science. The things we say we know are the things that scientific communities of experts have come to agreement upon. And so in those communities, you're not talking about one expert versus another. You're talking about tens, dozens, scores, hundreds, even thousands of scientists. And that's why organizations like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the National Research Council, or honorific societies like the Royal Society are so important, because they express to us the consensus opinion of the communities of experts. And that's what's most important, because that's where the scientific knowledge lies. Now, does that mean that they always get everything right? No, of course not. Scientists are human beings. Organizations like the IPCC are human institutions. That means they will be imperfect. And to expect perfection is to expect the impossible. But to expect that they can give us a robust appraisal of the state of scientific knowledge and that we can use that knowledge to make informed decisions, absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, I think we have time for just maybe one more question. And I'm tempted to add to that. Just love to hear your last word, because we've actually talked to, we've talked a lot about kind of the case in the negative, how to respond to skeptics. So it might be useful actually to hear your, airplane speech about why to trust science as we wrap. And in terms of the questions in the stream, there's a question that looks at the arc of public knowledge about climate change, say from the time that you wrote Merchants of Doubt to now. And how do you see the market for information and books, both about climate change and climate denialism? And maybe that's a good place to rest with why we ultimately should trust science.
Well, it's interesting. It's hard to pitch a book on climate change now. A lot of editors have the feeling that people have global warming fatigue. I've been told that. But at the same time, I think we see there's actually a huge hunger among people for good, accessible books about science and how it operates. So I think anyone who feels motivated to write a book and to go through the pain and suffering of it, you have to be a little masochistic. There's definitely a place for it. And it may take a little time to find the right publisher, but I think you can. Look, the basic argument of my book is pretty simple. I had to write 150 pages to make it into a book, but it's not actually that complicated. As I said before, science is an institution with an enviable track record. There are so many things in our daily lives that we take for granted that would not be possible without science. Even the fact that I'm standing here, sitting here, talking to you through a computer with electric lights, with, by the way, all my electricity comes from the solar panels on my roof. I'm hoping we're all awaiting a vaccination soon. I mean, so many important things, travel, so many aspects of our health that rely on scientific knowledge and technical developments based on that knowledge. So the track record of knowledge is really great. How do we get that knowledge? Well, my argument is that it's not about individual genius. It's about the processes of vetting claims so that when people make a claim, it's subject to really tough critical scrutiny. And it's only after something has passed through that scrutiny that we can say, yes, we know this to be true. And that's why we should trust science, not because of the genius of any individual scientist. Sometimes scientists might be geniuses, but most are not. Most are just relatively smart people who work hard. But they work hard and they work together and they pool that resource. And it's not always pretty. It's not always nice. It's not always kind. Scientific criticism can be really tough. But I think that toughness is actually a good thing. And it's taken me a little while to come to this view as well. I don't think we should be mean and I don't think we should be nasty, but that tough vetting of claims is actually why we should trust science. And so in some ways, I'm saying we should trust science. It's actually kind of tough, but that toughness is a good toughness.
I like that. Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. So many great questions, so many great comments about this. You've really hit a chord with this book, Naomi. So again, Mackenzie's going to put the links in the chat there. You can watch her TED Talk. You can read her TED Talk because TED Talks provide transcripts too. And I like that because I actually read faster than I watch. So I read TED Talks. You can read her book. You can read her book in Swedish. And you can read many of her other books, which we have also put in the chat. The book about the collapse of civilization is very compelling and very short. Again, Merchants of Doubt is a movie, so you can just watch the movie or read the book. And there's the new book coming out in April, which I like that. It has a picture of a diver on the cover. So if you could just leave us with a few last words, recognizing that a lot of people listening are scientists or science students, what would you say?
Well, I'd say overall that despite the challenges, a life in science is a very great thing. It can be incredibly rewarding. And the feeling of discovering something about the natural world is a deeply gratifying one. And as I said before, one that's not at all in conflict with spirituality, whether conventional or non-conventional. And I feel like in my own life, I hardly ever talk about this because I feel like most people don't get it and would just think I'm crazy. But I feel like one of the most exciting moments of my life was when I logged some drill core in Australia that went through the Cambrian Precambrian boundary. And in that moment, I felt that I understood, that I actually felt in my heart geological time. And that's kind of an amazing feeling to have. And science offers that opportunity for this feeling of deep, deep understanding of the natural world. But I do think as scientists, it behooves all of us to do what we can to share that understanding with everyone else around us.
Absolutely. That is a great way to end. It answers a bunch of other questions that we didn't even get to. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us. This has been recorded. It was streamed on our TTU Climate Center Facebook page. It will be posted on our YouTube channel. You can go back and watch it. You can share it. And don't forget to join us for our upcoming events. We'll be talking about the book called Falter with Bill McKibben. We'll be talking about Jerry North, who is a Texas climate scientist, history and memoir of climate science. And the link that Mackenzie put in the chat there, if you just click on that link, it will take you to all the information that we need. So thank you again, Naomi. Virtual applause from us and from all of us. Thank you everybody for joining us.
Yeah, it's been really fun. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.